If you want your band to get signed or noticed, or if you want to attract more clients as a producer, weak recordings will instantly sabotage your success and cost you opportunities. And with drums being the foundation of your entire recording, even if you're a guitarist, they need your full attention. So in this video, I'm going to show you some industry quality drums that I've created after 20 years of production and mixing work and working with various different record labels over the years. And I'm going to be showing you drum sounds specific to every different subgenre to best fit the different genres of heavy music, so your mixes will get you noticed. Particularly when it comes to heavy music, subconsciously, people are now more in tune with how good it sounds or how heavy it feels. Listeners today are spoiled with incredible sounding music. People are used to hearing professional quality mixes on Spotify playlists, YouTube, everywhere. And I think you also have to consider this when you're trying to submit demos to record labels. Whether you're trying to get signed or you're a big established band about to renegotiate a deal or sign with a different label, you might still be required to submit demos to make sure that you can still write good songs. And I've been in both situations, and I never want to submit anything for consideration that isn't as good as I can get it sounding and as close to a finished record. And this same thought process even applies to submitting demos to the rest of my bandmates when I come up with a song. If I come up with something that's a bit too simple or a little bit different for us, or just like a riff that's like, okay, hear me out, I want to present it to the rest of the guys in the band and make it sound as good as possible so they get the full context and can see the big picture, because I think sometimes the most simple and basic riffs are only executed really well when the entire production sounds huge. So if you want your music to stand out, make sure you give your drums the focus they deserve. And I say this as a guitarist, and as much as it pains me to say it, I think a really great sounding kick and snare in the mix is way more important than a great guitar tone, because the drums are way more important in the big picture when it comes to delivering a really powerful mix. When my band Solosis first started out, it was a completely different game. We started in 2000, and if we wanted to record a demo, we'd have to save up all our money and go to a local studio where we would record to ADAT tape, which is kind of like a VHS tape. There'd be no editing, we'd play everything live as a band, and just hope that it sounded good or that the engineer knew anything about heavy music. And even if the playing was great or the songs were great, it just doesn't cut it by today's standards. If you imagine someone's listening to your music on a Spotify playlist, they've never heard your band before, you've got about 5 seconds before they decide if they're just going to skip your song. Attention spans are shorter now, myself included, and people just aren't going to wait for your song to get good. So anyway, I'm here to guide you through some drum sounds that stand up against professional mixes, and I'm going to be talking about different characteristics of drum sounds depending on each different subgenre of heavy music. And if you're like me, you're probably incredibly frustrated that there aren't many drum libraries out there that sound like these finished, polished mixes that we all love. Or the only way of getting close to those records is just hours of tweaking and stacking up tons of plugins. And I honestly think there are tons of different subgenres of heavy music that just aren't represented or catered for with what's out there. So that frustration is what led me to create the Ultimate Heavy Drums plugin. I needed something for my own writing and mixing that instantly delivered results. Mix-ready drum sounds that guitarists like us have always dreamed of having at our fingertips. And some of these drum sounds have already made their way onto established records like the new Bleed From Within record. They used a blend of 2 different Ultimate Heavy Drum samples for the kick drums on that record. So I'm going to walk you through a bunch of different drum sounds and talk about what characteristics or key points to listen out for depending on the genre of music that you play. So one drum sound that I really wanted you guys to have at your fingertips that I know a lot of you would want is like a really modern metalcore sound, thinking about bands like Parkway Drive, Bring Me, Architects, Bad Omens, all that kind of stuff. And that's what led me to create this modern metalcore kit, and you can just load this up and this is exactly how it will sound. So the kick sound on a lot of these records is closer to a more kind of rock sound. The high end is quite linear and flat at the top. There's actually quite a lot of high end, but it's outweighed by just a little bit more of that thuddy low end, and the kick sounds like this. This is the Guru 22 alt mix, so it's the exact same drum samples, but I processed and mixed them in a completely different way. And the snares are typically more kind of mid to low sounding, just a bit more like fat, which I think works better for this type of music. And for this kit, it is the Ludwig 402 Supraphonic snare, and it sounds like this. And the kit just kind of has a more dense, thuddy, kind of lower sound to it. And this is how it sounds over my original demo for When We Were Young. So the next genre I'm going to talk about is like modern deathcore. Now, one of the most notable things, a lot of deathcore, not all of it, has that really kind of industrial, clanging, sustained ring on the snare. Sounds a bit like this. Hear that sort of sound in like some of the Lorna Shore breakdowns. Now, a lot of bands actually will drop in, or producers will drop in a sample of a really obnoxious snare like that just for breakdowns, and then maybe something different for like blast beat sections. So this kit I'm using here is called the Slam Death Kit. It's just a preset from Ultimate Heavy Drums, and we have that piccolo snare which is cranked, sounds like that. Some samples blended in there, a lot of sustain. I've actually added some sustain on the transient master, so you can see this is the snare. I'm adding a lot of sustain to really emphasize that ring. And the toms on this one, I'm using the Q toms, and the floor tom in particular sounds really satisfying. And let's have a listen to this in the mix. Okay, so we're going to check out this mid-2000s metalcore kit. Now, back in the day, there was an Oasis drum module called the D4, and it had a bunch of samples that made their way onto various metal mixes throughout the 90s and early 2000s. One of them in particular, the snare, is called Fat City, and it sounds like this. And you will have heard this snare sample on tons of records, but the one that sticks out the most for me is Alive or Just Breathing by Killswitch Engage. I have a soft spot for this snare sound, but if you want to use it in your mixes, it's just a singular one-shot sample. So if you have a really fast snare roll and you've triggered your snare with that, it just sounds like a machine gun. So I wanted to create a snare that sounded just like that, but multi-velocity, multi-sample, so it can sound really realistic. And that is what we did with this one. This is a Ludwig 402 Supraphonic snare in a low tuning, and this was just really a happy accident. When I got to mixing the samples, I was like, that sounds exactly like that snare sound. So let's check out in the context of this sort of Killswitch Engage style mix. Let's check this out. So that's pretty authentic to that kind of classic metalcore sound or some of that melodic death metal stuff. And the snare, really happy with the way that one turned out. Kick drums, this is the Q 24-inch kick drum, and it's been mixed and processed to kind of fit that similar aesthetic as well as that kind of Killswitch Engage kind of drum sound. So this next kit, this is more like a modern hardcore kind of sound, very aggressive and dense, punchy, and quite saturated sounding. Now this is something that I've actually made with a few of the one-shots. So if you remember in the mailing list, you get these free one-shot samples. That kick drum is like a really modern, kind of dense, punchy, quite bloated kick sound, but it works really well for this kind of music. And one of the snares, one shots I've got loaded in here, sounds like this. And we're blending it with the Ludwig 402 low tune snare. Okay, so the next genre I'm going to talk about is like symphonic black metal. And I'm thinking more in terms of bands like Dimmu Borgir, where the mixes aren't quite as slammed and modern sounding. There's a lot of orchestral elements and the drums need to be a little bit more refined and controlled. So the typical things to listen out for: kicks that aren't too subby, too much low end, quite brighter, a bit clickier. Snares, more mid to high tuning. Typically more reliant on reverb rather than room mics, particularly when you have got a lot of symphonic elements. Room mics, particularly cymbals in the room mics, can sound a bit too washy and messy for this sort of stuff. And typically the drums are all about the detail and trying to cut through that wall of heavy guitars and orchestration. So we've got this preset, the symphonic black metal kit, and I'm boosting the high end quite a lot on the kicks, the Yamaha 22. And for the snare, we're using this DW1. Actually got a bit of the overhead in there, a little bit less of the room mic, as I said, and a bit more reliant on artificial reverb for this one. Here's how it sounds in the context of a mix. So the next type of drum sound is one of the most iconic of all time. Talking about the Black Album by Metallica. And the characteristics of this kit is a lot of high end on the kicks, a lot of high end on the snare, a lot of high end on the cymbals, really bright sounding, but also really roomy, a lot of crack to the snare. For this kit, I actually did, for this 90s Stadium Metal preset, I actually used the mid-range or the mid-tuning Gretsch bell brass, but I've pitched it down quite a bit because that snare just has that kind of crack to it, and then pitching it down just to get it a bit more in line with the sound on the record. Pitched the kicks down a little bit too. Already we're using the Yamaha 24-inch kicks, which are already quite low sounding, and the Evans head ones, and I'm also brightening these up by using the tilt EQ to take them a bit more to the bright side, and then a lot of high end on the cymbals, really bright hi-hats, and we can check out how this sounds in the context of a mix. I'm next going to talk about the characteristics of thrash. So I'm a huge fan of Andy Sneap, who has worked with most of my favourite Testament records from 1999, The Gathering, up until the most recent one, Titans of Creation. And a lot of those mixes are my favourite mixes of all time. And he's also worked with thrash bands like Exodus for a similar amount of time. And he's worked with Creator, Zentrix. He's played in Hell, and he's now playing in Judas Priest. Typically, these kind of thrash mixes, you don't hear too much room sound, or at least not too much real room sound with a lot of kind of washy cymbals. Usually the cymbals are quite bright and defined, and there's more of a use of artificial reverb, particularly on some of those sort of mid-2000s records. Tighter sort of sounds, a bit more high-end and a bit more click on the kick drums. Usually the guitars in a more sort of standard tuning around E-flat to C-sharp, that kind of area, where there's a bit more bite and quite a bright sort of thrashy, snarly guitar tone, and the drums need to cut through in a sort of similarly bright manner. And because a lot of the music is really fast, the kicks have a bit more of a controlled low end to them, and the snares typically more of like a mid-range tuning as opposed to ultra high or ultra low, just that sort of like middle ground with a lot of snap to the snare. So I've gone for the Guru staved snare for this one. Sounds like this. Very similar sound to a lot of those kind of thrash records that I love. Kicks using this Q24, but you could also try the Q24 Resident Head On kick. Those both work really well for thrash, and we can switch between them in context of this song and see how it sounds. So obviously I love thrash music, and this kit, this thrash preset, is one of my favorites in Ultimate Heavy Drums. It has that really nostalgic feel for me, but I think these sounds work really well in a modern context as well. Okay, so the next genre and drum sound I'm going to talk about is old school death metal. Now, I just read the Scott Burns book, and it is the best book I've ever read. If you don't know who Scott Burns is, he produced most of the old school death metal records in the late 80s, early 90s. Bands like Obituary, Deicide, Cannibal Corpse, Suffocation, Death, you name it, most of those bands. He also did Sepultura's Beneath the Remains and Arise, which are two of my favourite records as well, that kind of ride the line between old school death metal and thrash. When you think about 70s and 80s music in general, there's quite a lot of deep, low snare drums. So if you think about 70s rock, 70s funk, deeper, thicker snare drums were a bit more common, especially in like pop music and like those power ballads with those massive fat sounding snares with a ton of reverb. And with some of those old school death metal records, the snares were typically lower as opposed to the more cranked, more modern sounding death metal stuff. And if you think about drum sounds like Arise by Sepultura, and particularly for this demo, I was going for something like Death's Leprosy. Now, a lot of people think that those old school records were just really raw and natural, but there's actually a ton of samples on those records. And if you get the Scott Burns book, he goes into detail about the methods they would use to trigger the drums and even edit the drums, particularly the kick drums. So they would convert the kicks into MIDI, and they'd sometimes just manually be shifting kick drums around as MIDI, with a lot of records, when they weren't tracking to a click and just manually moving kicks around to make it sync up and sound more in time if the drum had gone slightly out with their feet. So records like Beneath the Remains, Death Leprosy, Arise, all those records, you can hear the drum samples on the kicks and the snares. So the sound of that era has quite a lot of tape saturation because they were tracking to tape. Typically lower tuned snares that sound a bit like this, using that Ludwig 402 low tuning snare again, and this one of my favorite kicks from UHD, which is the Tama 22 resonant head off. And it's just the way it's been processed. I just really like the way the low end kind of sits. And believe it or not, that kick in the snare would actually work really well if you were doing like some synthwave kind of 80s retro vibes like The Midnight, that kind of thing. Even though a lot of those records they recorded at Morrisound in Tampa, which is a great studio with a huge live room, but typically you hear a lot more artificial reverb than you do like really roomy sounds on those records. So up next, going to talk about new metal kits. Now, one of the most common things in a lot of those old new metal records is quite a cranked, high-tuned, quite ringy snare. If you're thinking about like Limp Bizkit, Deftones, that kind of stuff. Typically, kick drums, if we're talking about Deftones and Limp Bizkit, not quite as clicky, not quite as metallic, a bit more thuddy. But yeah, a lot of the bands had that crank sounding snare, not always a piccolo snare. Sometimes they were just using like regular snare, sort of like a regular kind of 14x5 or 6.5, but just absolutely cranked. So for this preset I've made, which is the Shove It kit, which is based off My Own Summer by Deftones, I'm using the Gretsch bell brass in a high tuning. And one of the things I've done on the preset is I've used these envelope filters to really tighten up the decay. So it sounds quite weird if you just listen, you can hear the snare kind of cut off. The snare's got quite a tight sound on this mix. And for the kick, we're using this Guru 22. Out of all the kicks in Ultimate Heavy Drums, this one's a little bit better suited for rock stuff, but it still works really well with metal. It sounds like this. Definitely got it a bit more thuddy sounding. I've got some of the overheads blended in, and I've taken off a lot of the high end with this tilt EQ. So that way would be a lot brighter, this way is a lot darker. So let's check it out in the full mix. So when I got the first version of this plugin back to test out, one of the first things I wanted to do was to see if I could emulate the drum sound on Digital Bath by Deftones. Now when we were recording the sounds and sampling all the drums, that was never the intention. I was never thinking, oh, I have to get a snare and a kick that sounds exactly like that. But I did realize that I had some stuff that was pretty close to that anyway, and with a few tweaks within Ultimate Heavy Drums, I could get it sounding pretty close. So same snare I'm using on the Shove It kit, the bell brass side tuned, and the same kick, the Guru 22, but there's actually some reverb on the kick, and I'm actually adding a little bit of sustain on the kick drum. This is all, again, just already within this preset, so this is how it comes as standard when you load up the preset, and we can have a listen to how it sounds in context of the full mix. So the cool thing about this is we've got that really boomy kick sound. We've got the room mics turned up, we've got some reverb on the kicks as well, which is pretty rare. And the transient master actually affects the sustain in the room mics as well as the close mic. So we're adding a bit more boom to that kick, which is not something you'd want typically with most metal mixes, but this isn't really like a typical metal song, so it works really well to give a bit more vibe and depth to this kind of sound. So following on from the Deftones kit, we've got this Limp Bizkit style kit. This is another preset, Imp Bizkit. What I've done for this one is also add a ton of sustain, because the kick on Break Stuff in particular has tons of sustain to it, way more than I realized when I was A/Bing against the original. So let's have a listen to how it sounds in the mix context. So going for another new metal adjacent kind of drum sound, going for a Slipknot vibe with this Not Slipping preset. Now Joe typically used a 13-inch snare because he was a smaller guy and it probably just felt better between his legs. A lot of those records have quite a nice kind of ring and sustain to the snare, which is quite typical for a lot of new metal stuff, but also, you know, Slipknot all the way up until this point at least. Kick drum is the Q kick again, resonant head. This is typical for a very similar kind of Colin Richardson kick sound as well, and he mixed All I Hope Is Gone. And the snare we're using is this Ludwig 400 14x5. Now it's not a 13-inch, but the way it's been tuned and the way it's been processed has a really kind of satisfying ring to it. Works really well for that kind of new metal sound. I really love snares with a lot of ring and sustain to them that kind of have that sound to them and kind of pop through the mix. So a lot of those Deftones sounds, a lot of those kind of new metal sounds I really like, and it still works really well for this type of music. So let's listen to this one in the context of a mix. Drum sound I'm going to talk about is that kind of 90s groove metal kind of thing, talking about Pantera in the 90s or Machine Head, like Burn My Eyes, that kind of stuff. And this was, particularly the Machine Head records, they definitely had some drum samples in there, particularly on the kick drums. I think on Burn My Eyes it's an Alesis kick sample, but on The More Things Change they sampled the kick drum from the start of 5 Minutes Alone, blended it in with something else maybe. It's a little bit fatter sounding than the Pantera kick, which the Pantera one has got way more high end than it does low end. And on The More Things Change, even though that sample's in there, I think there's a bit more low end to fatten up the sound. So drum samples were coming into play in the 90s a lot more. Both those bands, particularly if we're talking about like Far Beyond Driven and Burn My Eyes, a bit more of a higher kind of crack to the snare sound. I know Vinnie Paul used quite a deep snare, but I think he had it quite cranked, and the snare on Burn My Eyes is pretty crank sounding as well. So I made a preset to sound just like that. This is the Shotgun Snare Blast preset. We're using this Q24 kick, which has a similar kind of focus in the high end as like that kind of Pantera sound, and works really well for this. Sounds like this. And the snare, we are using a Gretsch Bell Brass mid-tuning, which is kind of just the default snare on Ultimate Heavy Drums. And the toms we're using on this one are the Q drums, and they sound phenomenal. And we can check out how they sound over this intro fill right now. Next genre I'm going to talk about is this kind of more butt rock, radio rock drum sound. This preset is the Back in Nickel kit, and it's based on a kind of Nickelback vibe. So again, with the kicks, I'm actually adding sustain. So for this one, I'm using the Yamaha 22 head. Now this one's typically quite metal sounding, but with the pitch, I've pitch shifted them down a bit, which puts the high end in a different place, a little bit more of a rock sound. And there's a ton of sustain on the intro to this one. And I've got the intro kick, I'm using the left kick for the intro, which has even more sustain added to it. And then when the band kicks in, I switch to the right kick, so we can have a little less of that sustain. And this is one of the cool things about having the two kicks. Even though it's the same samples, you can process them in different ways for stuff like this. Snare drum is this Gretsch bell brass low tuning. It's actually kind of, I'd say probably more of a mid-range tuning, but for this preset, I'm actually pitch shifting it down a little bit as well. And the pitch controls in this plugin are great, they work really well. Tilt EQ to take off a bit more of the high end, so I'm just kind of tilting the whole EQ of this kick just a bit to the left, which is more emphasis on the low end, because this type of music, the kicks aren't usually super clicky, super metallic sounding, a bit more of a big rock stadium vibe for this kit. And typically with this type of music, super low tune snares, you could either go for that type of snare or the Ludwig 402 Superphonic and the lower tuning. That would work really well for this kind of stuff. Okay, so up next, this one's not metal, but it's a great drum sound, great production, and it's Jimmy Eat World preset, Jim's World of Alt Rock. Again, more of a rock sound for the kick. This Guru one works the best for the less metallic sounding stuff, but we're adding a lot more of the overhead mic, surprisingly, which you wouldn't really do in a normal mix, but that adds a bit more of like a dull thud to the sound. And we're using the tilt EQ to make it darker, same with the close mics. And the snare, more of a mid-range tuning, we're using the Ludwig 402 mid-range sound, and it sounds like this. So you can download Ultimate Heavy Drums from the Middleton website, install it, and instantly have these drum sounds at your fingertips. And if not, you can still take all these principles that I've discussed to help you tailor your drum sounds to fit the music that you play. If you want a further look at some common drum mixing mistakes, then check this video out. Or if you're all set with an awesome drum sound but you can't get the clarity that you want from your guitar tone, then check this video out.